Hello, and welcome to a presentation on Safe Spaces by the Office of Multicultural Affairs. This presentation was initially part of a larger presentation that covered trigger warnings and safe spaces offered by the Center for Teaching and Learning's First Thursdays series. The Center for Teaching and Learning provides faculty and staff with professional development opportunities, including the First Thursdays series, which comes out on the first Thursday of each month and focuses on relevant current issues in higher ed. The purpose of today's presentation is to give folks a brief overview of the history of safe spaces, specifically as they relate to higher ed, to recognize some common myths and misunderstandings about what they are, and to discuss what safe spaces look like on the UNC Asheville campus. We'll start by taking a look at what exactly defines a safe space. A safe space can be a physical place or person, either a physical or intellectual space. On college campuses, traditionally, safe spaces have existed to meet the needs of marginalized groups. But when we're thinking about the dominant culture, they've also existed as intellectual spaces where people have the freedom to express themselves. A safe space might be a student affinity group, a cultural center, or a residential program like a living learning community. But intellectual safe spaces can also be created in classes and at events. The important thing to remember is that creating a safe space is about creating an environment where people feel comfortable enough to expose themselves to risk. At the heart of both physical and intellectual safe spaces is a desire to make sure that intellectual freedom and creativity can thrive. The key thing to focus on with the first kind of safe space is the acknowledgement that not all spaces are inherently conducive to allowing those values to thrive. There are many spaces in our society where people don't necessarily feel that it's safe to be vulnerable, because openly sharing one's views has been met with resistance from the dominant culture, or even violence. So, a counter space is developed, one that allows people to express and advocate for themselves in a more comfortable and confident way, and allows them to feel able to expose themselves to some level of risk. In the second type of safe space, there's an assumption that the folks who occupy that space already have the skills necessary to feel confident in their power to speak, and therefore they feel more able to expose themselves to risk. It's important to highlight that one type of safe space isn't necessarily better than the other, nor are they at odds with one another. A helpful way to visualize the difference between the two is to think of them as two different areas in a cyclical process of scholarship and the free exchange of ideas. In many ways, both types of spaces complement one another, in that the ability to have one kind of safe space creates room for the other. Next, we'll discuss the history of safe spaces and what that looks like on college campuses. Today, we tend to think of safe spaces as something that began at colleges, and we lump them in with things like sensory rooms and therapy dogs, but they actually have roots in corporate America. In the 1940s, social psychologist Kurt Lewin began developing sensitivity trainings for corporate leaders. Lewin got his start in a small textile factory called the Harwood Manufacturing Company. The factory had recently relocated and found that its workforce was less experienced, but was also primarily made up of women, which the management was not used to. The company began to have issues with absenteeism and productivity, and so Lewin's idea was to create spaces where people felt able to participate in the decision-making and goal-setting process, with the hopes that this might solve the problems the factory was facing. But in order to do that, the workers had to feel safe enough to give honest feedback, which can't happen if folks are worried about getting fired. Lewin's response was to create group sessions where workers could talk without fear of retaliation from management. What he found was that when the workers could speak freely to one another and participate in decision-making, productivity actually increased. So, you begin to see that creating these kind of safe spaces, although they weren't called that at the time, can be a great tool for leadership development. And so the concept was expanded into trainings for managers and CEOs. This type of space gave corporate leaders an opportunity to get feedback about individuals or processes that may have gone ignored in the workplace. In other words, the creation of a safe space allowed those things to rise to the surface so that they could be dealt with. As we move into the 1960s, we begin to see this concept taking shape in different kinds of activism, such as the women's movement and the creation of Black cultural centers on college campuses. At this time, in general, we begin to see more women and more Black students on campuses, which, up until that point, had been predominantly white and predominantly male. In 1960, the first campus-based women's center in the U.S. was founded at the University of Minnesota, based on the home place model, as a part of the state's plan for the continuing education of women. This plan was created to meet the needs of married women and those returning to college as mothers. The Women's Center was designed as a space where women could learn from one another, freely share their experiences, and be safe from both physical and psychological threats posed by men. Again, because this was happening in the 1960s, this space was very much influenced by the larger women's movement that was taking place at the time, which was seeking to create these types of spaces and encourage women to speak freely and build their collective power. So, while we begin to see the results of these women's strategies of resistance in the successes of the women's movement, the means through which they accomplished those things were actually even more important. Spaces like the Women's Center at the University of Minnesota allowed women to build communities. These spaces showed people that, number one, they weren't going through these experiences alone. Many of the things you were facing were not unique to you, but they were unique to the experiences of that marginalized identity. So, now that we know these experiences are collective, and we're safe enough to talk about it, we can start to strategize how to address these issues. This template would continue to be used throughout the 60s, with the creation of Black cultural centers, the first of which began at San Francisco State in 1968. As we move forward into the 1970s, the first LGBTQ center was created at the University of Michigan in 1971. It's in the 70s that we first begin to see the term safe spaces being used. Even in this context, the term is not specific to higher ed. Scholar Moira Kennedy describes the term being used when talking about bars, clubs, and bookstores in LA that were LGBTQ friendly. But while the term wasn't exclusive to college campuses, it was very much rooted in higher ed up until this point. So, when thinking about the history of safe spaces, there are a few important things to note. Even these intentionally created spaces were not necessarily devoid of risk. What it meant was that the people who occupied these spaces shared a common set of experiences. Within these spaces, there was a general understanding that the world outside could be hostile. And while within safe spaces, we will not recreate the same pressures and norms that affect marginalized people in the general society. The commonality between all of these spaces, including Black cultural centers, women's centers, and LGBTQ spaces, was the idea that they existed to build community, collective power, and to create some distance from people who would undermine those efforts. And so you begin to see more and more of these spaces popping up on campuses across the country, and by the 1990s, they're pretty common in most areas. By this time, safe spaces tend to be used by colleges as recruitment and retention tools. College administrators and admissions counselors could point to these spaces as outward signs of progress that the institution had made to address systemic issues. So, as you move through the 1990s and into the 2000s, you see that while these spaces existed, the overall campus environment wasn't necessarily supportive to marginalized students. And so, these spaces took on a new identity as resource centers. They became places where students from these groups would go to get advising, tutoring, and mentorship because in many cases, the versions of these services offered to the general campus were not culturally competent or respectful to students who held marginalized identities. Next, we'll explore some of the common misconceptions and debates surrounding safe spaces. One common misconception about safe spaces is that they are exclusionary. This argument typically comes from people in the dominant culture who accuse marginalized folks of self-segregating or even being hostile. This often goes along with the idea that there's nothing wrong with the campus at large or with the larger society, and that marginalized people create safe spaces as a way to avoid engaging with others who don't share their identities. One way we can conceptualize this is to think about the differences between introverts and extroverts. Extroverts might feel energized by being around other people and feel comfortable in large crowds or large spaces. Someone who is more introverted, on the other hand, may need time alone or in a smaller group to recharge and feel energized. For introverts, having that opportunity to reflect and recharge is what allows them to function in larger spaces. So for marginalized folks, safe spaces help provide the confidence, support, and way of recharging from the pressures of larger society, because the everyday environments that they're in may be non-supportive at best and violent at worst. Another common misconception of these spaces is that they encourage balkanization, which in this context refers to the tendency of students to group themselves along racial lines or identity-based groups, and the idea that this inherently creates conflict, not only with the larger campus, but among these groups themselves. A great example we can look at when thinking about this is the Du Bois College House at the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the oldest racial and ethnic-themed residence halls in the country, and was created in 1972 to focus on the heritage and experiences of Black students. At the time it was created, it was almost entirely populated by Black students. By 2012, 46% of residents reported a racial identity other than African American. Today, it is one of the most racially diverse residence halls at the university. So, in thinking about that figure, it's important to consider who is being prioritized in a space. While a predominantly Black space may be considered segregated, predominantly white spaces are not. Studying Black identity is looked at as exclusive, while white identity or identity that does not recognize other experiences is considered the default or the norm. And so, if we talk about a school that is 46% students of color, that school would be applauded for diversity. However, if the other 54% were Black, or Indigenous, or even queer, the entire space would be defined by those terms. The school wouldn't be celebrated, it would be seen as just a Black space, or an Indigenous space, etc. This speaks to the ways that we talk about integration, which always refers to marginalized groups going into, quote, normative spaces, and never the other way around. This means that the benefits of those spaces happen on terms that make the dominant culture comfortable, and when we center marginalized identities, the dominant culture doesn't typically feel at ease. So to reiterate, in response to the claims of balkanization, when we actually look at these spaces, we see that they are in fact more racially and ethnically diverse than some of their counterparts. So think about spaces like the affinity groups or the living learning communities at UNC Asheville. When they have had time to grow and really put down roots, they often end up being much more diverse than other spaces on a college campus, including the classrooms themselves. They also tend to be much more accepting than the campus at large, just not on the dominant culture's terms. Instead, these spaces have their own terms, and while all are welcome, there is an acknowledgement that within these spaces, specific identities are centered. These kinds of spaces also typically work more closely with other groups. On our own campus, for example, think about the relationships between groups like BSA and OLA, Hyannis House and Legacy, and the relationship between Hillel and UNCA Out. While these affinity groups are all dedicated to serving specific populations, they're actually working together, which is something you see throughout higher ed. When thinking about the concept of balkanization, when you're actually on a campus versus reading about this concept in the media, you can see that the reality plays out very differently. Another misconception is that safe spaces create something of an escape room, a bubble, or an echo chamber, where students can avoid hearing alternate views. To counter that perspective, when people have a foundational understanding of marginalized groups and the historical context of their oppression, or they have conversations with people about their lived experiences, they tend to think about these issues a bit differently. When we're looking specifically at safe spaces, the reality is that for marginalized people, the majority of their life is filled with counter-narratives, opposing ideas, and the reality that critics suggest they're trying to be protected from is the environment in which they spend most of their lives. When thinking about the critiques of safe spaces, it's important to ask how often the folks who are criticizing them are actually going out of their way to engage with ideas and beliefs that are opposite to their own views. So, in a sense, this criticism can be somewhat hypocritical, because the detractors of safe spaces aren't necessarily internalizing their own criticisms, whereas marginalized people constantly spend time in the spaces of the dominant culture. Another criticism of safe spaces is that they act as an escape room in an intellectual sense. Dr. Jean Twenge talks about this in her book iGen, Why Today's Superconnected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. One of the things that emerged from her informational interviews with iGen students is that this generation of students tends to see the college campus as a kind of home. So, if they see college campuses as their home, then what does that make faculty and administrators? One could argue that in the eyes of students, that makes them something like parents. And what do parents do? They protect their children. This argument against safe spaces begins with the idea that students' views are stagnant and concrete, but once you begin having conversations with them, people often find that they are more receptive to counter-narratives than critics would give them credit for. In other words, if you focus solely on the negative media around safe spaces, or even cherry-pick specific data about this issue, you would miss the reality that people and their ideas grow and evolve. So, while students may come into college expecting the campus to be their home or a place where they feel protected, over time they grow to understand the value of dissent and conflict. What's important to point out is that the key to this kind of growth is coming from a place of respect. If pushback or dissent begins from a place of respect, students are much more open to change. On the other hand, if you approach them in a disrespectful way, you can't expect the same kind of openness from students. Not because they're stubborn and resistant to growth, but because you're approaching with disrespect. Another common criticism of safe spaces is that they stifle free speech. This goes along with the idea that opposing views don't have the right to be expressed, or that people who express those views should be deplatformed if they're too objectionable. In a 2017 report by FIRE, a group that advocates for free speech in higher ed, 93% of students agreed that a variety of guest speakers should be invited to the campus. 64% agreed to having changed an attitude or opinion about an issue after hearing from a guest speaker. Additionally, half of students recognize that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. So to reiterate our previous point, if students are open to changing their minds and listening, the criticism that safe spaces stifle free speech is simply not accurate. Another issue we often hear about with safe spaces is the conflation of comfort and safety. These two things often get confused, and it's important to recognize that especially when we're talking about intersectional identities, comfort does not equal safety. When we talk about this issue, we need to ask ourselves who controls a space and whose comfort is prioritized. Historically, when we look at these spaces, we see that they were often galvanized around a broad identity, like being a woman or being black, and they also had rules of engagement based on that central identity. However, while everyone in that space may share one identity, that doesn't mean that there isn't diversity within that group based on other underlying identities. For instance, if we're talking about black spaces, how might the language, ideas being exchanged, or the rules of engagement be experienced differently by someone with a disability? Or, how might a conversation about queer identity be different if we think about how race intersects with queerness? These examples show that even within a space created for marginalized people, we could be saying or doing things that are offensive or hurtful to some folks who have other identities we may not be conscious of. In order to unpack those things, there first has to be someone in the space who holds that identity, and they also have to feel safe enough to express dissent. So, we can see that even in a safe space, certain people get to dictate what is or isn't offensive or hurtful, and they also get to define what is safe. Until we actually hear from those voices of dissent, these power dynamics can remain hidden. Again, we have to think carefully about the differences between safety and comfort, and who gets to define these things in a safe space. Next, we'll take a look at examples of safe spaces on the UNC Asheville campus. A few might include the affinity groups, such as Hillel, NASA, Asia, or Ola, which are all affinity groups that serve as safe spaces for marginalized populations. Hyannis House is another great example, whose mission is to serve women, the LGBTQ+ community and its allies, as well as those affected by sexual assault. There's also the Disability Cultural Center, which focuses on disability as a form of diversity, and serves as a space for culture and community building for students with disabilities. Now that you've heard a few examples of what safe spaces look like on our campus, you might ask yourself how you can create and support safe spaces. First off, all of the previous examples are great places where you can refer students. Another important thing you can do is to remember that Google is free. There are so many resources to help you learn about these issues, and it is not the responsibility of people from marginalized groups to teach others about their experiences. It's important to remember that although there are a lot of great general resources out there, no group is a monolith, and not all people define safety in the same way. So while you can find plenty of tips for creating safe spaces, no one source can offer you a foolproof way of engaging with these groups. For example, if you aren't a veteran or don't have experience with people who are, you can find some great resources online to help make your classroom safer for students who are veterans. For this example, you can think about keeping desks apart and not connected, keeping aisles clear to provide an easy exit, and not assigning seats so that students have a greater sense of control. Again, these can all be great ways to make your classroom safer for veterans. Will every vet need these things? No. These are some general ways that you can make the space safer for those who do need these measures. Another example of something you can do is to create guidelines for discussions that will establish a basic level of respect when having conversations in the classroom. When you're doing this, it's important to consider whose safety is being prioritized, and know that what feels safe for some students can be hostile or linguistically violent for others. For example, what might be needed for a white student to feel comfortable may be a micro or even macro aggression for a student of color. Likewise, what may be safe or comfortable for a cisgender student may be hostile to someone who's trans. So, again, consider whose safety you are prioritizing in the classroom. It's also helpful to consider if space is being created to challenge those ideals and norms. To do this, when conflict arises, ask questions. Where does that come from? Why do you feel that way? This encourages folks to think about and question their own ideas or what they are trying to share. This way of questioning is a great way to challenge students that is unlikely to be interpreted as an attack while still directly asking them to examine their views. To wrap up our presentation, we'll take a few minutes to talk through what we've covered today. To reiterate, comfort does not always equal safety, and typically, when we talk about safe spaces, we often really mean spaces where folks are comfortable. While it's completely okay to be uncomfortable, there are ways we can support people and start from a place where safety and respect are the baseline for engaging with one another. In a space like a classroom that is under the control of a faculty member, physical safety can, for the most part, be guaranteed, but comfort cannot be. This, again, highlights why it's important to emphasize the difference between safety and comfort when engaging with these issues. If we can bring that conversation into the space, it encourages folks to step back and ask themselves, am I safe or am I comfortable? Which may make them more likely to step into the space a bit more and be willing to take risks. Historically, safe spaces have been looked at in different ways, based on both who's asked for the spaces and who's occupying them. Folks in the dominant culture may define safe spaces differently than those from marginalized groups. A person from a marginalized group may ask for that space because when they engage with the dominant culture, they are constantly encountering hostility or things that are offensive or problematic to them. Whereas when someone from the dominant culture asks for such a space, they may want to be able to say those things without being viewed as a bad person. So again, we need to look at who is being centered in a space and whose comfort is being prioritized in order to get to a place where those things can coexist to some degree. To have constructive conversations, we need to acknowledge this as a framework for engaging with one another. Whether we're talking about a classroom, an affinity group, or any other space, remember that the concept of a safe space can be defined very differently, but all types aim to promote the exchange of ideas. They just start from different places. Think back to our example of introverts versus extroverts. One starts by building community and knowledge in a group setting, while another starts more intimately, in a smaller and more comfortable setting. Thank you for joining us for this presentation on safe spaces. To learn more, you can visit multiculturalaffairs.unca.edu. Check us out on YouTube at UNCA Office of Multicultural Affairs and on Instagram at UNCA_OMA. If you'd like to get in touch with us directly, you can email multicultural@unca.edu, and you can also stop by our office at Highsmith Student Union, room 237.